the European Scale-Up Question, Episode 2, Fragmentation, Europe's Hidden Growth, Tax. You heard Thomas Jatzombeck defend Germany's innovation model. His argument essentially was this: Germany is the third largest economy in the world. The Mittelstand model, specialized, resilient, global competitive mid-caps, has produced durable economic strength for decades. It's not a failure. It's a deliberate design. I think he's right about the outcomes of the model. What I want to examine in this episode is the infrastructure that model operates inside, because there's a layer of friction between European ambition and European execution that exists regardless of which economic philosophy you subscribe to. What I want to examine in this episode is the infrastructure that model operates inside, because there's a layer of friction between European ambition and European execution that exists regardless of which economic philosophy you subscribe to. Whether you're trying to build a unicorn or a hidden champion, whether you want to scale globally or dominate a specialized vertical, you are building inside the same structural environment. And that environment has a cost, a measurable, specific, compounding cost. It is called regulatory fragmentation, and it's the single most underestimated growth tax in the European startup ecosystem. And here's how it works, and here's what it actually costs. The European single market is one of the most significant economic achievements of the post-war era. 500 million customers, unified trade rules, free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. For companies selling physical goods across European borders, the single market is genuinely transformative. The infrastructure for that kind of commerce has been built and refined over decades. But there's a gap between what the single market delivers for trade and what it delivers for startups. And that gap is most visible at the moment a company decides to scale. Consider what it means for a US founder to expand from California to Texas, then New York, then Illinois. One legal system, one corporate culture, and notably 80% of all US initial public offerings are registered in Delaware, which means most serious US companies choose a single, founder-friendly jurisdiction from day one. One regulatory baseline, one language, one tax code. Okay, with state variations, but they are manageable within a common federal framework. Now consider a European founder who has achieved product market fit in Germany and decides to expand to France, then Poland, then Spain. This is not one expansion. It is a sequence of 3 distinct market entries, each with its own corporate law, its own employment framework, its own VAT structure, its own contract enforcement system, its own language, its own local compliance requirements that interact unpredictably with the European level regulation. The friction accumulates with every market added, and that accumulation has a direct operational consequence. In my conversation with Tomasz Mazurek, sorry for butchering his name, co-founder and CEO of Fundingbox and a technical coordinator of the EU-funded DeepSafe project, building Europe's first standardized pan-European investment instrument, has described what this fragmentation does to investment deals specifically. Cross-border seed deals in Europe close 3 to 5 times slower than their equivalent deals in the US. 3 to 5 times. Not because the business fundamentals are weaker, not because the founders are less capable, but because the legal infrastructure required to execute a cross-border investment in Europe, the jurisdiction-specific modification, the tax structuring, the compliance review, adds weeks and even months to processes that should take days. This is not a marginal inefficiency. That is a structural growth tax levied on every company that tries to move capital across European borders. Before we talk about the solutions being proposed, we need to talk about a cautionary example, because Europe has attempted regulatory harmonization before, and the most intrusive recent example is the General Data Protection Regulation, also known as GDPR. The intent of GDPR was legitimate. A unified European data protection framework replacing a patchwork of national laws with a single standard. The logic was exactly logic behind every harmonization effort. Reduce fragmentation, reduce compliance costs, create a level playing field. What happened in practice? For large technology companies with legal teams and compliance infrastructure, GDPR became manageable. For the companies that most needed regulatory simplicity, small businesses, early-stage startups, it became a significant operational burden. Research estimates GDPR compliance costs for small businesses at approximately 1.7 million per year in ongoing compliance expenditure. For a startup in its first year, the range runs from 5,000 euros at the minimal end to 150,000 euros for a company with any meaningful data handling. A study by Dekarolis and colleagues found that companies exposed to GDPR experience on average an 8% drop in profits. 8%. And here's the deeper lesson from the GDPR precedent. GDPR was conceived roughly 15 years before it was fully operational. It was announced as a regulation, binding across all member states, and it still took years of implementation, interpretation, divergence, and enforcement inconsistency before it reached anything approaching functional harmonization. Different member states interpreted core provisions differently. Enforcement varied dramatically by jurisdiction. Small companies bore compliance costs disproportionate to their scale, and the regulation that was designed to unify European data law created, in its implementation phase, a new layer of jurisdictional complexity that companies had to navigate. This is the pattern. Europe's harmonization attempts are structurally sound in intent. They are frequently complex in implementation, slow in rollout, and disproportionate in their impact on companies least equipped to absorb compliance overhead. This matters enormously for how we evaluate the solutions currently being proposed. Before we get into those solutions, it is worth asking, what do founders actually do when they are confronted with this fragmentation? The data is revealing. 80% of all US IPOs in 2023 were registered in Delaware. Delaware is not where most US companies operate. It is not a technology hub. It is a small state with a specific legal and corporate governance framework that has made it the default incorporation jurisdiction for all US companies. Founders choose Delaware because the infrastructure is known, the legal proceedings are established, and the system is designed to accommodate high-growth companies effectively. European founders facing cross-border friction are making an equivalent calculation, and many are reaching the equivalent answer. Not Delaware, but the United States. Manzurek gave me two concrete examples from his own investment experience. An Italian startup spent 2 years navigating back and forth with lawyers trying to secure cross-border European investment. After 2 years, they set up in the United States and received their investment there. 2 years of lost momentum, 2 years of operational focus diverted to legal structuring. And 11 Labs, the Polish AI voice company that reached a $6.6 billion valuation, made a different decision at the outset. They analyzed the landscape and chose US incorporation from day one. They did not navigate the European system and lose. They looked at the system and decided not to enter it. That is a more significant signal. It means the cost of fragmentation is not just the friction experienced by companies trying to scale across European borders. It is also the companies that never try, that calculate the friction in advance and route around Europe entirely. The European system loses them, not to failure, but to rational avoidance. The proposed solution to European corporate fragmentation currently receiving the most political attention is what is called the 28th regime, or EU Inc. The concept is structurally elegant. Europe currently has 27 member states, each with its own corporate law. The 28th regime proposes a new pan-European corporate structure, a 28th option, that would allow a company to incorporate once under unified European rules and operate across all member states without needing to establish separate legal entities in each jurisdiction. The implementation target, as currently proposed, digital establishment within 48 hours for less than 100 euros. If that sounds almost too good to be true, that is because the distance between a Commission proposal and a functional regulatory reality in Europe is really short. The current timeline has the first company registration going into effect by late 2027 or early 2028. That is 2 to 3 years from now at the optimistic end. And if we apply the GDPR precedent, announced as a regulation, fully operational years later, interpreted inconsistently across jurisdictions in the interim, then 27-28 is likely the beginning of an implementation, not the end of the transition period. But Zurich, who is building the EU scale instrument specifically as an interim infrastructure solution for the period before the 28th regime is operational, was direct about this. He pointed to unresolved questions around tax residency, social security obligations, and labor law that the 28th regime proposal has not yet answered. He compared the GDPR trajectory explicitly. A regulation that was supposed to simplify and instead created years of interpretive complexity. His conclusion: Europe needs a bridge solution now and not 2028. Now. That bridge solution is EU Scale, a standardized 2.5-page convertible loan instrument designed to reduce the legal friction in cross-border seed investment without waiting for regulatory harmonization to arrive. The proposal is that if investment instruments are standardized, the legal costs of closing a cross-border deal drop significantly. The estimate from EU Scale analysis is that a potential reduction of up to 70% in legal costs for cross-border rounds. 70%. That is the scale of the friction that standardization alone could remove before a single line of corporate law is harmonized. I want to be precise about what EU Scale is and is not. It is an early-stage instrument. It does not solve the full stack of fragmentation a scaling company faces. It does not resolve the employment law differences, the tax treatment divergence, the public market access gap. But it is a data point about what targeted, practical infrastructure can achieve while structural reform moves at regulatory speed. And it illustrates the core problem with European harmonization efforts. The gap between political will and operational reality means the companies that need solutions right now cannot wait for the solutions that are coming later. There's a dimension for this fragmentation problem that is specific to Germany, and it is worth isolating. Germany does not just operate within European fragmentation, it adds a layer of its own. Germany has a federal state with 16 Länder states, each with significant autonomy over economic policy, education, labor market implementation, and administrative processes. The startup and innovation infrastructure, the DE Hub network, the startup factories, the university link ecosystem is deliberately decentralized across this federal architecture. In my conversation with Thomas Jatzombeck, he described the governance logic of the DE Hub system in a way that reveals something important about how Germany's federal law actually functions. We don't force any federal state to start a hub, he said. The other way is true. They are pitching for starting the DE hubs. That framing matters. The federal architecture in Germany is not experienced as a top-down imposition. It is a network of self-selected nodes, each pitching to join the federal infrastructure. Each hub is financially dependent on attractive private capital participation. It only exists if industry believes it is enough to fund it. That model has real strength. It creates genuine local ownership, prevents central bureaucracy from dictating priorities across diverse regional economies, and ensures that hubs which fail to generate value are not artificially sustained. But it also means that Germany's innovation infrastructure is, by design, a federal system without a unified national deployment layer. For a startup trying to navigate from Munich to Hamburg to Cologne, 3 cities in the same country, the regulatory and administrative environment shifts in a way that would not apply to a company moving between San Francisco, Austin, and Chicago. This is not a failure of German policy design. It is a feature of German federalism that creates costs for companies that need to operate nationally before they can operate internationally. And it compounds with the European layer above it. A German company scaling to France and Poland is not navigating one transition from Germany to Europe. It is navigating from a specific regional ecosystem in Germany through German federal variations into European legal fragmentation, into destination market specificity. Each layer adds friction. Each layer extracts time, capital, and management attention. That is the structural environment inside which European scale-up is attempted. Here's the pattern that's run through everything we have examined in this period. The fragmentation cost is not concentrated in one place. It is distributed across every layer of the system. Investment instruments, corporate law, employment frameworks, tax treatment, public market access, and administrative process. No single intervention removes it. Each reform addresses one layer while the others persist. The EU scale instrument could reduce cross-border investment friction significantly, but it does not touch the regulatory environment a company faces once it has received that investment and tries to hire, operate, and grow across borders. The 28th regime, when it arrives, could provide a unified incorporation option, but the GDPR precedent suggests that binding regulation and operational reality in Europe are separated by years of implementation friction. The European Commission estimates that current simplification efforts could save up to 5 billion euros in administrative costs by 2029. That is a meaningful number. It is also a projection about a future that does not yet exist. What exists now is the environment Mazurek described. Deals closing 3 to 5 times slower. Legal costs that could be reduced by 70% if the infrastructure existed. Founders calculating the friction in advance and incorporating in Delaware before they have shipped a single line of product. The scale-up gap is partly a capital problem, as we examined in episode 1. It is also a friction problem. And friction is insidious in a way that capital gaps are not. Capital gaps are visible. You can measure the 50% shortfall. You can point to the 11 large funds versus 137. Friction is invisible until you experience it. It does not appear in a single headline number. It accumulates in legal fees, in delayed closings, in divergent management attention, in the momentum that a company loses while its lawyers are negotiating jurisdiction-specific modifications to a term sheet that should have taken a week. In the United States, that term sheet often takes a week. In Europe, it takes 3 to 5 times longer. The difference compounds over a decade of building a company, and this is the hidden growth tax. In episode 1, we looked at what the capital architecture produces at the aggregated level, the 50% capital gap, the 30% unicorn reallocation rate. In this episode, we looked at where the friction lives in the operational level, in legal infrastructure, in deal timelines, in compounding costs of navigating a fragmented system. In episode 3, we go one layer deeper. We examine the specific mechanics of the European venture capital stack, why it is structured the way it is, where it runs out of capacity, and what the structural differences between European and US capital markets means for a company trying to move from Series B to global leadership. This is where the capital architecture gets specific. Episode 3 is next. This is Startup Radio. I'm Joe.
That's all, folks. Find more news, streams, events, and interviews at www.startuprad.io. Remember, sharing is caring.